Hello and welcome to this webinar from University Business and Education Technology in conjunction with Cypher Learning. My name is James Higgins and I'm a reporter here at The Title. Today we're discussing an incredibly prescient topic, that is, what will the future of online teaching and learning have on the development of the HE and FE sectors around the world. And in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, the sector is grappling with that most fundamental of questions: what comes next? So to discuss this and lots more, I'm joined by three experts who I will introduce in a second. But before I do, allow me just to say to all of our audience that we would love you to send in your questions to us. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen for you to do so, and we'll have 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the session to look at those. I have had a few in already from those that have subscribed, but please do put more in because it would be great to know what you're thinking and what the challenges are where you are in the world. Please also use the chat function as well to talk amongst yourself. There might be things that you want to raise awareness of, stuff that's happening at your institution that you think people might be interested in. So please do use that. It's great when a dialogue opens up. So without any further ado, allow me to introduce who we're going to be listening to today. And as will become apparent, our three panelists are based around the world and we're spanning quite a large different set of time zones. I think they're all about as far away as it is from me as it is possible to be on the globe. So let me start off by introducing Graham Glass, who is the CEO and founder of Cypher Learning, and he's coming to us from the West Coast of America. We also have Colin Christie, who is the Director of Digital Transformation at Eduan Colleges in Manila in the Philippines. And we also have Kathy Allen, who is Executive Director of Inclusive Higher Education Certificate Program, and she is based in Denver, Colorado. So thank you all three of you for joining me today. I'm going to start off with you, Colin, if I may. Can I start off by asking, so obviously you're based in Manila in the Philippines, so could you give us a little bit of an overview as to what the state of play is in Manila at the moment in the Philippines? What are the challenges there? And then could you give us a bit of an overview as to, I suppose, the impact that that experience has had on students in the last 14 or so months?
Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for having me. It's an honor to be with you today. I wish I could report happier news here from Southeast Asia, but unfortunately not. If anything, where the pandemic is raging here worse than ever. I think 10,000 cases a day. Much like the third world, we've only had, I think, 2 million vaccines available for 106 million population total to date. So we're pretty much still in lockdown. I think we're in the world's longest lockdown, actually, even had curfews and whatnot. So online learning is the only mode of instruction, has been for about a year now in the Philippines. The government hasn't allowed any in-person schools at all, K through 12 and higher ed, throughout the country here in Metro Manila and in the provinces as well. So of course, this has had a dramatic impact on students. We have some unique challenges here because, here in the metro, we're fairly fortunate in that we have good connectivity, internet connectivity, but once you get out of the mega Manila area, that's not quite so true. And so it's had an impact on, on our students. So I'm very excited to be here with all of you, to explore how do we address those challenges.
So Kathy, you're obviously based in Colorado. Could you give us a bit of an overview as to what the pandemic has been like for your students?
Yes, my students specifically are students with learning, intellectual and developmental disabilities on college campuses taking courses with their peers. So we are just part of the student population. In Denver, I've got to say that they've handled the pandemic really well. Things are starting to open up slowly. The campus is opening up slowly, returning to whatever normal might be in the next semester. So there's great hope that there will be more in-person learning. But my programs, my students have been online for 14 months. And when you think about students with learning disabilities, there's inherent issues with executive function, with knowing where to locate items, where to access items, how to do. And one thing that I've been thrilled about is that technology and online learning has really supported these students to continue their education, even though the pandemic is raging.
So obviously, Graham, I mean, you have quite an extensive career behind you in terms of teaching firsthand. So from your perspective, how do you see the impact of the pandemic on students? And I'm thinking particularly different types of students, because there may be some that have felt that the pandemic has not been as much of a challenge as others.
Yeah, that's a good question. As you mentioned, I've taught personally thousands of students earlier in my career, but now we're responsible for this cloud-hosted learning platform. And part of what I've enjoyed during this time is working with educators around the world to try and figure out how can a platform like ours really facilitate, pretty decent teaching and learning during a time where people have suddenly become disconnected. People in the past have used a lot of these online platforms just for more everyday grind work, submit an assignment, grade a paper. But one of the things that we really try to do was to add a lot of functionality, whether it's to do with collaboration technologies, ways to generate online communities, way to create much more engaging courses. So during times like this, people can actually still teach very effectively. And a lot of the feedback we're receiving is that our platform really is making it a lot easier to teach than people thought. But certainly one of the things that I hope will come out of this is a greater understanding of how do you use online tools to actually teach asynchronously rather than always having to rely on one-on-one live teaching.
I mean, that leads us on perfectly, I suppose, really to the topic of the challenges that there are ahead of HE and FE colleges. So perhaps I could go to Kathy, because you discussed the fact that different types of learners might have experienced online teaching in a different way. From your perspective, what are the principal challenges for making what comes next inclusive?
Oh, great question. I think that we need to start before students land on campus. This is something that needs to be rolled out from kindergarten through 12th grade in preparation for not just a college education, not being on a campus, but for life. The reality is that the way that we interact, the way we communicate, the way that we learn, the way that we order groceries is now online. And so for our students to be truly included, we need to start early, teaching digital literacy skills and preparing students for this type of interaction that we're experiencing right now, this two-dimensional interaction. Many times, special education students with special needs, all students rely on proximity, let's say, somebody near them, somebody to prompt them. So what I see a huge benefit of online learning is that it truly has promoted executive function skills in students. And all students need this, all people need this, the ability to plan ahead, the ability to be on time. These are work-related skills, competencies that translate from school to work. So I think that the challenge right now is realizing that this is our new normal. There's going to be a component of online learning moving forward for every student. And it's valuable and it's flexible and it can be individualized. And I'm really excited about the future of learning for all students.
Do you have any view on what challenges there might be to reaching that? Are there any obstacles you perceive as needing to be overcome in this area?
Yes, there's a clear digital gap, the haves and have-nots with technology, with Wi-Fi, with accessibility. So looking at that, and then also if a student is able to log in and can do this independently, we're going to have to truly plan our lessons to be inclusive and using universal design for learning in our coursework. And then for us to be flexible, maybe moving forward, just starting forward and saying, okay, this is new, this is different. We need to plan for tech, whether we're in person, whether we're online, or whether we're blended.
Colin, I mean, you mentioned that there are some digital barriers to students in Southeast Asia. So I suppose reflecting on what Kathy said around the haves and the have-nots, how much of that is an issue to where you are in the world? And are there any other challenges and obstacles you think the sector where you are needs to overcome in this field?
Well, yes, indeed, it is. It is a challenge. As I mentioned, the metro type areas in the Philippines are pretty well wired, even with fiber optic and whatnot. But once you get out into the countryside, not so much. And so, fortunately, though, the technologies and the platforms that are out there have been a tremendous help. So I also share Kathy's optimism for the long term, because having to overcome some of the challenges that we've been thrust and forced into, I think are giving us new capabilities and skills that are going to really prove useful in the long term. In particular, I want to go back to what Graham was saying about creating community and interactivity. Oftentimes when I talk about the move from the classroom setting to the online setting, I talk about this idea of a loss of signal. And what I mean is, when you're there in person in the classroom, you are getting a lot of non-verbal cues. You're able to sort of scan the room. You can see who's paying attention, who's not, who seems to be struggling. There's a lot that you're gaining, that if now you're teaching online, especially asynchronous, but even synchronous, a lot of times here when we do synchronous, cameras are off because of bandwidth issues. So we've been very happy that some of the new capabilities that are there to organize students into groups and to use some of the analytics to see how the students are progressing and kind of align the lessons. We get back signal that we lost. Indeed there are challenges, but there are also some very exciting things that we're learning as we go through the process.
And one thing I just want to add is, Cypher Learning, we've tried to do as much as we can to help teachers and students during the pandemic. And one of the features that we added a while back is offline mode. And that was actually prompted us because we do have a lot of customers in locations with sporadic internet access. So for example, you can download your Neo app, you can connect to your course room, you can get all the various videos and things. And if you get disconnected somewhere, you can still access those materials through the app. So I just wanted to mention that, it's not a glamorous feature, but that's the kind of thing that really can make a difference.
That's really great that you mentioned that, actually, because I was going to come to you and say, with those two things mentioned, because Colin also mentioned the kind of loss of signal, and I know that sort of data analytics is something that we'll probably get onto in a bit more detail later, but I suppose given those two things, are there any other obstacles you think that the colleges and universities perhaps need to overcome in this area to make sure that their digital learning is?
Yeah, I mean, I think, my godson, I was chatting with him recently, he's in the UK, and he was saying, he's doing a lot of his courses online, but one of the things that he misses is the sense of community. And I know that when the pandemic first started, that was one of the things that we really wanted to innovate in that area. So one of the cool things that we did, and once again, it's not some massively complicated feature, but one of the things we wanted to do is that when you logged in, you immediately had a sense of activity and community, not just like a flat screen. So we added this little feature so that if there were a lot of people in your course, then the tile for that course on your dashboard would start to flash, and a little pulsing button, it's like a heartbeat. And the more activity there would be in a particular course or lesson or group, the faster it would flash. Or you would go into a course and you would see a little scrolling widget that shows you what all of your friends are doing in that particular course. So it's like a little feature, but it does mean that when people log on, they feel like they're logging into like a live community with your friends, and there's activity, not just something which is boring. And at a higher level, it's all about making the system more engaging. So you don't want people to sit down and they're looking at a flat screen and they got bored and they walk away. You want it to feel like, hey, there's actually stuff going on here. There are some fun things to do.
And I'll just remind everyone in the audience, if people have joined us after we started, please do put questions to the panelists. We have 10 to 15 minutes at the end to answer those. And if you do give us a question, it would be great if you could include where you're from and the institution you're at, just so that we have an understanding of your background. Okay, so let's think about then what comes next. We've heard an awful lot about universities and colleges needing to create some sort of blended or a hybrid model for the future. But I mean, that covers all range of different things. And what kind of a balance is it that we're seeking to strike? What is it that we want to take from both? So Kathy, perhaps I could start with you. What's your view on that?
I think that starting with the blended education, that's a good platform. It allows us to go in person, it allows us to go online. I think that, Graham, what you mentioned, that community, that engagement, I think that as instructors, as course designers, we need to plan our courses around how are we going to engage students. And one of the things that I've tried using is a simple routine, that there's a lecture, there's a survey, there's a small group project, rinse and repeat. So that's one, it allows my students to recognize a routine, and I use a certain routine in every single class so they know what's coming next. But really adding those other levels of engagement so that students know that there are other students out there. I overlay something called Kahoot. I know a lot of colleges and universities use a survey system like Kahoot. That allows the student to look at the screen, to hear the lecture. I do most of mine live in a synchronous format. But the students are able to look at the screen live, and then we go to the phones to play Kahoot. It serves two purposes. I have the students engaged on one level on the screen in front of them, their laptop, and I'm also using their phone. I'm taking their phone away from them so they can participate in our class. The students said that they absolutely love that overlay. They like to check in on what they've learned. They love to compete against other students. I can see immediately what areas of content I need to revisit. And then we go into small groups, discuss that, come back, introduce a new topic. So simply put, having a consistent routine, having something that's predictable for students, and building engagement in. And then another level of building engagement is something outside of class. Many times I'll leave a Zoom room open so students can have lunch together. And it's amazing the discussions that go back and forth with that. So I think intentionality, how do we engage our students? How do we present our content? Really needs to be well thought out with our students' needs in mind.
I mean, you mentioned restructuring your content. Would you envisage doing quite significant restructuring to the way in which you deliver your modules, perhaps how you were doing it a few years ago?
Yes, I was doing everything live. Like I said, I would bring up on a smart board the NEO coursework. We'd go through that. Students would do their assessments. But what I'm seeing is I need to record what I'm doing so that if students weren't there, they can listen to the lecture later. They can see the student engagement. So recording the whole screen and the whole process, I think, is important, not just little snippets. But with that said, I do find that chunking things into smaller units. And what's really nice, again, about the learning platform that Graham has designed, I use NEO, is I'm able to truly chunk out individual concepts and start to stack those. So one of the things I'm going to be doing moving forward is taking a 16-week course and breaking it down into 4, maybe 5 stackable units. That allows me to use repetition for prior learning, to use spaced repetition to really embed that deeper learning, and it'll allow me to show students with badges, trophies, and such that they are learning.
Colin, from your perspective, do you have an opinion on, in terms of a blended and a hybrid learning model in the future, what aspects work best online, work best offline, so to speak, in a kind of live format, in-person teaching? Do you have a perception on what the right balance is to strike there?
Yeah, this is actually one of the topics that excites me the most. None of us would have ever wished this pandemic on any of us, but I entered the world of academia just about 3-4 years ago. Before that, it was in technology in the tech sector, and this topic of models and learning delivery and whatnot. I mean, there's been discussion, and pardon the pun, most of it's been academic for so many years. And the level of experimentation has been fairly low, and adoption has been fairly low. So now we're thrust into this mode where we've been forced to challenge everything. How do we set up, as Kathy was saying, the modules here? We at Enderon have done a very similar thing. We took the semester, we divided it in half into an A period and a B period. We cut the number of classes students take, therefore, simultaneously in half as well. And in essence, they take half as many courses, at an accelerated pace. We've gone A to Z through our learning frameworks and challenged everything in the framework. And we've engaged with students and student government and the faculty and the leadership of the university. And we're challenging and questioning. And frankly, these are things I was very used to doing in my days in industry. Companies to survive, they do this all the time, and in academics, it's been a little bit slower. So I don't think there's necessarily sort of a one correct answer to what should the model be between blended, hybrid, et cetera. It's going to be very situational specific, but I think more of the point is to examine the process by which you arrive at the correct solution for you. And now I feel that all the various stakeholders are so much more engaged in making that happen, and I think that's a very good thing.
Graham, I mean, would you have any perspective on that challenge? And from your point of view, how well has the HE and FE sector around the world kind of grappled with this challenge, and how well do you think they've understood what sort of a balance they need to look for in the future? Yeah, well, I think, I definitely come at from an educator's perspective, because as mentioned, I used to teach computer science many years ago. And I'm a big believer that one of the main things that you can get good at as an educator is being a storyteller. So whenever I was planning out a course, I'd always have, the introduction, and then there's the journey through the material. Along the way, there are certain key punchlines that I want to make. There's a few little detours, and then there's kind of like the end of the course. And but I wanted to make it fun, and I want to make it engaging. So that's how I would start. And then I would start plugging in the various materials along the journey. But one of the things, especially when you're now teaching asynchronously and you're doing this offline, the question is, how do you take students through this organized journey, even when you are not there? So one of the things that we did very early on is we came up with this concept of automation, which is that allows you as an educator to script when certain things occur in the course, trigger certain actions. So I'll give you an example. It might well be that when you enroll in the course, the first time you get to the course, I'm going to script there's going to be a pop-up video welcome. So whether it's 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 in the afternoon, you get a personalized welcome. Dear John, welcome to your course. Now let's just say I want to give the student a little boost. So when they finish lesson 1, I'm going to give them a badge, like great start. So I can script that in. Then maybe I want to do something where if you do really well on a quiz, I'm going to give you a special award. And I'm also going to unlock some advanced materials because you'll clearly know what you're doing great. But if you don't do well on the quiz, I'm going to unlock some remedial material so you don't get left behind, and you can then dig deeper into that particular subject. So using automation is a way that I can script a really nice, dynamic, engaging adventure through the courses that will work regardless of whether you are online at the same time as the learner. The second thing that I would do, and this goes back to what Kathy and Colin were saying, which is people really do enjoy a sense of community. Sometimes they like a little sense of competition. So we're big believers in gamification. So at various parts during the course, you get points and badges and levels, and you can get very creative. If I'm teaching meteorology, I can have a level called Typhoon, or I can have another level called Lightning Wizard or something like that. And you can even organize the students into teams to compete against each other. So we support something called team gamification. So I think obviously it's going to vary based on the educator, but we try and put lots of really useful functionality into our system so you can create and script these quite engaging adventures through your learning, regardless of whether people are online or not. That's really interesting. I mean, you discussed there a little bit about the importance of creating a community, and that actually leads on perfectly to the next question I wanted to ask. And in fact, Graham, I might stick with you if I can. I mean, you've discussed there a bit about community, but in terms of belonging and student wellbeing and mental health, there can be sometimes a link between students feeling perhaps more isolated and their mental health suffering if they feel that they're not able to physically partake in things, and perhaps using EdTech might make them feel a bit distanced from others. How do you think that the sector, people like you, can help universities and colleges to overcome that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, talking as a platform provider, one of the things that we try and do is give a lot of different ways for students to communicate and collaborate. So whether it's integrate, simple, obvious things like integrating with MS Teams, for example, or Google Meet, that allows people to easily have video conferences. And seeing one-on-one video is something which definitely helps to make people feel, they're all working together. Obviously, things like built-in live chat is really nice for just the occasional quick conversation with someone. One of the things that we try to do from an assessment perspective is add some really fun assessment types, like there's something called a debate that we support, discussion assignments, team assignments. And I think Kathy mentioned sometimes she might give an assessment that you have to collaborate with other students in order to make your submission. So all of these things are ways that educators, can use this functionality to encourage or sometimes even require students to collaborate during their learning adventure.
Kathy, I mean, is there anything that you would add to that? I know that you have done quite a lot to try to make your students feel included in the process. Is there anything that you would add to what Graham said?
Allowing students to keep their microphones open. Now, it could be very distracting because of that stray cat, baby crying, knock on the door, phone ringing. But we've got to interact and engage as human beings. And that even though we are two-dimensional human beings, I'm looking at you on screen right now. Colin, I'm going to pick on you. You talked about signal. I think that we need to learn to read the signals in 2 dimensions. And there are things, that's one of the reasons I don't use a background. When I first started, I used a background and I thought, no, if I'm going to engage with my students, I really need to be a little more vulnerable. And I found that this pandemic and my teaching has enhanced my teaching style. I would walk into a classroom before and almost play a role of teacher. Okay, I've got to be funny here and I've got to trigger this there. But you can look behind me and get a sense of who I am. You can see family, you can see a brain, you can see an old Windows server. Who am I? And that was one of the things that I just really found that I needed to allow myself to be vulnerable as an instructor. I needed to be able to mess up, admit to the mistake, and move on. How many times have I delivered a brilliant lecture with the mute button on? We're human. And I think letting our humanness shine through the screen is going to really keep our engagement up with our students and model for our students what to do with us.
That's a lovely answer. And I hope not too many of your audience are now going to be staring at your bookcase trying to figure out who you are, Kathy. That could be an interesting parlor game, couldn't it? Sort of getting people's images up from their webcam. What sort of person lives in this room? Colin, and perhaps I could turn to you next. So in terms of making sure that students' well-being and mental health are as protected as they can be, I'm thinking particularly about moving forward, perhaps where there is going to be an online and an offline aspect to students' learning. How can you make sure that students feel as part of the community if they're online as perhaps when they're in person with their peers in a room?
Yeah, this is a great question. And, Graham and Kathy, just to add to what they said, I think there's both the technology tools that help us do this, and then there's also just the human side that Kathy was referring to. So often as educators, we're all in these discussions now about so-called 21st century skills and remembering that we need to educate people for the around soft skills and empathy and things like this. It's also a really good reminder for we educators to do the same. And picking up on what Kathy said is be aware of the environments. Oftentimes, especially here in the Philippines, people live in quite large families. So very unlikely that the students, when they're in a live session, are in their own bedroom with the door shut. It's more likely they're in a community area in their home with brothers or sisters or parents or cousins, in the background. So rather than thinking of that as a distraction, bring it in. We use a lot of the tools Graham mentioned to engage. So the team activities or the debate skills features that are in Neo and whatnot, and then we'll have the students work with each other during their asynchronous times, and then when we go live on video, oftentimes I realize that there are family members in the audience as well. So the students are presenting they're giving their team presentation to their peers, and hey, encourage the folks in the family that are also watching along to be the cheering section. Nothing wrong with that. We just have to think in a different way. Can you imagine? I mean, it's such a different paradigm. We would never think of family members wandering into our campus classroom and sort of sitting in at the back row and somehow engaging what's going on. But of course, that's what's happening now. So we have to be cognizant of that and turn it into a positive by marrying the technical capabilities that we have, thanks to Graham and his the platform, and then combining it with the human element.
Oh, Colin, I just want to add on to that. You brought up something that is just brilliant. I've been teaching a digital literacy class to bring students up to speed so that they can go online. And I've noticed more and more that parents are starting to join. And this is something that I think that as educators, we need to be aware of, is that there are more people being educated than what we see on the screen. Sometimes you can hear them. Sometimes you'll see a head. But we have the opportunity to really reach out beyond that one person that we're seeing. And especially with digital skills, I've found that many parents are actually going through their child's coursework in NEO so that they know, one, where is their student? What is their student learning today? How can we share language? How can we, share the vocabulary really helps. And how can the family support the student? So I think that with this type of platform, with e-learning, we have the opportunity to reach out to so many more.
So let's think about then, I mean, we've, I suppose, started to touch on it actually, and I think your digital skills point really speaks to this. What skills, approaches and processes do teachers and lecturers need to develop perhaps in their skill set in order to harness these EdTech resources in the best way possible? Kathy, perhaps I could start with you. What new ways do you think lecturers and teachers should approach their position and their job as an educator?
I really fall back on process. I think that we really need to examine our process. We have delivered in one way for over 100 years. Students come to our classrooms, they sit down, we impart the knowledge, and good luck. Reach out to me if you need something. So I think that we need to be very mindful as educators, the process that we're learning and building our coursework, what our objectives are up front, making sure that we align our objectives, our competencies with what we're actually teaching. How do we know when our students, these are all things that we do in classrooms now, but we now have the ability to really, through the dashboards, we can see where our students are. We can see where they're falling behind. We can see immediately assessing what they know. And I think that this is going to be something moving forward, that when we plan our lessons, we plan our semesters, that we plan for how do we deliver and how many people can we reach through differentiated learning, through universal design. And the NEO platform allows our program to differentiate, to guide students. As Graham was saying, there are so many little toggles that you can make that if a student doesn't perform well on a particular assessment, I can guide them back to relearn a section and then assess again to move on. I can lock that student from moving on until they actually show proficiency. And if they don't, I know. I didn't know that with students in class when they're nodding their heads and everybody understand, oh yes, and they're gone. Now I can actually see it in real time. So I hope I hope that answered the question. Thank you.
No, I think it does. I mean, I've spoken to academics who, you know, that suddenly they are using editing tools and creating videos and editing up clips of things, short videos sometimes for their students, or doing the same with audio files and creating sort of short podcasts for people to listen to. I've spoken to academics that are getting to grips with learning design and even things like moderating chat rooms. And that's something that perhaps they never used to have to do, but actually checking in and adding notes and questions and prompting things and making sure that you're engaging with the conversation as it develops. These are all new things that many academics tell me that they're learning about. So, Graham, from your perspective, are there some new skills that our educators need to develop?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that Kathy mentioned was the idea of competencies. And some people use that term in a very, very kind of generic way, but other people use it to mean a specific about learning competencies. And I know when I used to teach computer science, I had quite a good system that I used, not just when I was teaching computer science, but I founded a training company and all of the instructors that I hired all followed my process. And the process would be this: before I wrote a single line of material, I would write down all the competencies that I was going to cover in my course. And I'm not talking about just, I'm going to teach computer science. I'm saying all the various aspects, maybe 50 or 60 competencies that I was going to teach in my course. Once I created those competencies and I knew, okay, I'm covering all the right material, then and only then would I actually start creating the various teaching materials and assessments. But I would mentally tag each bit of teaching material with the competency that it was teaching and each particular assessment with the competency that it was measuring. So that way, everything kind of tied together under this framework of competencies. So I found this was a good system, and this is one of the things that we built directly into Neo. And one of the reasons that I mentioned that I think it's actually quite good to start becoming familiar with this more formal idea of competencies is that it means that if you have one course which teaches a particular competency, and then you take another course which also teaches the same competency, you can start creating an aggregated view of how well you're measuring that competency that spans courses, which is really nice because one of the one competency, for example, could be something as generic as creative thinking or critical thinking. So as I'm taking a physics course and a mathematics course and an English course, I can then see how well am I doing with critical thinking, and across those courses, I'm getting an aggregated view. And I think that's particularly useful when you start talking about what you were saying about videos. If I create a video which is about photosynthesis, if I can tag it and say, this is teaching photosynthesis, and I have a question bank which says this is measuring photosynthesis, then I can actually share it with all of my colleagues. And if they start using that video in lots of different places, it's all tied back to an individual competency. So I think this is something which can definitely work in a traditional setting or a more asynchronous setting, but it does tie together all of the things that you're doing so that at least you can measure the students' understanding of all these various areas.
James, could I jump in there on this? Yeah, I think, you know, Kathy and Graham have both talked about process. They both used the word process, and you know, you can see how exciting it is, all the capabilities we have now. So I'll just add, just by giving some very on the ground sort of practical things that we've done that we found very useful, because there is tremendous amount of new skills that the faculty need to pick up. So some of the things that I would suggest, number one is, you know, use your platform for delivering those skills to the faculty. So we set up a online learning, you know, skills course in essence for our faculty. We put it on Neo, enrolled all our faculty into it. So for one thing, they get to experience the platform as students instead of as teachers, and it's modularized. We delivered it also in a hybrid way. So we had some live sessions where we all got together and we recorded those videos, but then we have self-paced activities as well. And then what we did was we identified the section heads and then also sort of the early adopter types, you know, in terms of mindset, the folks who really were keen to to race along with the capabilities. And we focus heavily on making sure that I'll use the word that Graham used, that we have the competencies that those folks, and then we use them to cascade those skills to those in their sphere. So the section heads, sort of our first line of building up those skills and competencies, and they were able to cascade that knowledge in their through their departments. And then another thing I think that has been very important is we set up an online support form so that we can have dialogue, ongoing dialogue. So it can be used in a number of ways. If someone's having a particular issue or problem, then of course we can address it very quickly. But actually what it's also evolved into is sharing best practices. So someone says, oh, I just discovered this great new thing. I can do debates on Neo, or I can, whatever it is, and shared that, and even do screen clips. So then what we do is when we see particularly great suggestions of in the support forum, then we can add that into our training modules. We can add those ideas into our training modules. So I think those are just some very practical ideas. I think when the pandemic hit, we were all just in firefighting emergency mode, and it was difficult to do that. We're far enough along now where I think someone also used the word earlier, intentional, that it needs to be intentional, not reactive, and sit down and put together the competencies and skills, not only we want our students to get, but the faculty as well, and put the training mechanisms in place to get them there.
And I would like to piggyback on that too. You bring up such good points, Alan. Get to know your platform. Something that's inherent, that's been added, I don't know if it was inherent in Neo, but it was been added to Neo that's been really helpful, is that students can demonstrate their knowledge through an audio recording, through a video recording. I can respond to them in audio or video or in writing. So now we're starting to really look at what are students' learning preferences, how do they want to interact, and then really if the student gives me a video, I like to respond to them in a video. If they give me a written assignment, I like to respond to them in writing. So, getting to know our platform well enough that we know the ins and outs so we can truly personalize learning for students.
Uh-oh, did we lose our moderator?
Looks like we lost. If he doesn't pop back in a minute, we can keep the ball rolling.
Yeah, Kathy, can I respond to that? We should talk later because we can share so many experiences. Exactly, have the same experience. What I discovered was when we're doing assessments, I love the capability where you can leave a comment when you're doing the grading, and the students get notified. They get a notification, especially if the app installed, they get a push notification, and then within minutes you get questions back. Oh, either pleading for a reconsideration or just asking a question. Why did you make that particular comment? And then I discover I engage in these, not quite real time, but almost near real time back and forth with students. And I wasn't, I'm also teaching at Enderun. I wasn't experiencing that so much in the classroom setting. So ironically enough, there's actually more engagement, in some areas of what we're doing because of the nature of the platforms that we're using.
Yes, and to be able to individually differentiate for students. I had my first student, well, not the first student with the vision impairment, but the first student that came to me and said, I'm blind. I am blind. I see very little light. He's studying music, and it was wonderful to have JAWS, which is a screen reading technology, work with Neo, and to see the difficulties what he was having with the assessments, and to work with that young man to build assessments for him, and then to be able to just individualize assessments moving forward. So once I did that in fall semester, moving forward to spring semester, I thought, okay, I know who my students are now. What are their needs? How do I know? What do they need to do to feel successful, to be successful? And again, I just want to frame this with, I am a special educator. But I do believe that that education is special for everyone. So we need to individualize education for everyone. And it's almost impossible to do it live. But if we can put the thinking in and front load our intention to educate everyone, then we are going to be much more successful than we'd be one-on-one or in person in the class.
Hello again, everybody. I'm so sorry. For some reason, my tech decided to crash, but that might well be an issue that you've all experienced doing online teaching. So I'm sure I'm not the first person to suddenly freeze and fall out of a Zoom call. Hopefully everyone's been kept entertained whilst I've been gone. But if I could grab hold of the stick again and just quickly ask before we get to questions at the end. A couple of questions. One I'd like to ask is about assessments, and we have already had a few questions in from people that are watching around assessments and what EdTech will mean for those. It gives us new ways to assess students, but it also gives us perhaps new skills that we should be assessing. So Colin, perhaps I could start with you. Do you have any view on that?
Yeah, this is also another really key topic. I think we've been through a bit of a steep learning curve over the last year in the area of assessments, because what we've learned is the way we did assessments in a in-person classroom is very different to the way you do it online, and just relying on for one thing, there's the difficult issue of proctoring when it comes to exams and things like that. So I think one of the ways I like to think about it now is the more traditional sort of assessments around multiple choice questions, and the sort of traditional type of assessments, really much more not about assessing the student or for grading purposes. It's a tool for the students themselves. So I think those are great, and especially if you de-emphasize how that falls into the grades, that as they go through the modules, then they take an assessment. It's really for them to understand how well they're grasping the material. And then when it comes to the assessment of the student performance, then really we're looking much more at the outputs that they can produce, having now gained this new knowledge and skills, whether that be presentations or papers or things like this, and so but it's an area that we're still learning, quite frankly, but definitely it does.
Can I add just a couple of things which I think are relevant? There's two things that we did specifically in NEO to address some of these assessment questions. One of them is very nice support for peer-to-peer assessment. So I'm really into scaling education. I used to have over 100 people in my courses when I was teaching computer science. And these days you actually have educators that are teaching thousands of people online, which is pretty remarkable. And the nice thing about peer assessments is that you can set an assessment, and then you can say, for example, randomly assign 3 people to provide commentary on any one other person's assessment. So the nice thing is, you as an educator, you don't have to literally look at every single assessment constantly to give the feedback. You actually let the students assess their work. As an educator, you might be the one who provides the final grade, but at least it gets a really nice chance to mix all the students and get them leaving hopefully constructive comments in each other's work. The second thing, going back to self-assessment, we did put a lot of work into our quiz question bank facility. It's one of the areas that NEO really shines. So you can create a question bank with 100 questions, and then say, every time you take this assignment, pick 3 questions that are tagged with the keyword hard, and 2 that are tagged with medium, and 5 that are tagged with simple. So every single time you take that quiz is creating a completely new randomized version of it. And you can say, this is not graded. This is simply for your own edification. You can take it as many times as you want. So you don't have to worry about cheating. It's really just so that the student can get better at that particular material. So those are 2 areas that I think that we put a lot of effort into NEO, and hopefully those are things that really help, especially during these kind of times.
Kathy, do you have any view on the ways in which you might change assessments or might develop them in the future?
Yes, we've changed the way I refer to assessments as feedback. really trying to take the stigma of grades off of it. And really it's feedback. And what I want my students to look at is, did their learning process work for them? And it also gives me feedback. Did my learning process work for them? So I really think that changing our language, changing sort of the paradigm of what students expect, taking away the search for the grade and go back to the quest for the learning. I think that's going to be wonderful. And Graham, you didn't mention again the assessments. Something I found is that if I can take away writing from many of my students, there's procrastination with writing, there's fear of writing, but I have had such deep, I can really tell that my students learned deeply through their audio. They will go through and tell me what they've learned, and they will add in the personal experiences. And whereas I was getting, maybe 3 or 4 sentences as a response, a written response, now I'm getting a 20-minute long dialogue. Say, I've thought about this. I'm able to get into my students' brains with this type of assessment. What did they think? How did they perceive it? And that allows me to really focus in and say, okay, you are right on here, but we might want to tweak this thought a little bit. So I think that the way that we assess, even though the automation that's available for, multiple choice, things like that, to have something immediately graded and give students immediate feedback. I think that if we're looking for depth of knowledge, what have you really learned? The audio and the video components that are embedded in the learning platform are brilliant.
Graham, I'm going to turn to you for our last question before we do some Q&As from the audience. From your perspective, and you will have an overview of the sorts of things that are coming, the big changes that might happen. I'm thinking particularly around things like AI, but what are the big changes that will kind of feed into EdTech, and how will they impact on teaching and learning in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we've always tried to innovate in this area, and we're definitely of the belief that learning platforms are going to become more proactive in the future. And I don't mean proactive in the sense of replacing teachers. I think they can be like your learning assistants, if you like. So if you go to Amazon, for example, and you are shopping for something, Amazon basically figures out what you're looking for and starts making you useful suggestions. And they put a lot of work, a lot of investment into their algorithms for doing a good job. And we're doing exactly the same thing with Neo, where we're going to be releasing a lot of AI technology infused into the platform, so that if a student is interested in a particular area or they're falling back in a particular area, then it can start making recommendations on how to get better. One of the things that we're specifically doing, though, is we're going to give complete control to the teachers on how much of those recommendations are scripted from the teachers and how many of them are generated by the AI. So, teachers want to, they don't want to use a platform which is recommending all kinds of stupid things to their learners, but they might appreciate the occasional bit of advice from an AI. So the way that we're doing it is one where the platform is going to give you more and more recommendations, more advice, a little dashboard that shows how many minutes you've spent working towards a particular goal in a particular week and how successful you are. But it's certainly going to be something which is under the control of the educators. And we're calling this concept intelligent learning platform. So later this year, Neo is going to be going from learning platform to intelligent learning platform.
Mm-hmm.
So could we move on then to some questions from the audience? There are an awful lot. So I will maybe ask everyone to keep their answers fairly short with the time that we have left. But let me start off with this question here, which is about teacher stress levels when managing hybrid classes, the fact that they need to switch from online to face-to-face and backwards and forwards. And this person asks how administrators can help alleviate anxiety levels. Does anybody have any thoughts on how staff can manage the stress of perhaps getting to grips with a totally new way of doing things?
Yeah, large amounts of red wine.
Yeah, that could definitely help.
Just kidding. Although it definitely can help.
It definitely can, yeah.
I think that I'm just going to give the tech response versus maybe the educator. I think automation is a big thing. I think that, you know, some people just get overwhelmed by the sheer amount of volume of work that they can do. And so one part of maybe dealing with the stress is figuring out, are there ways to use automation features to automate some of the daily stuff to give you a little bit more time for, you know, putting on your educator hat and actually inspiring your students.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody have anything they'd want to add?
Well, I think actually the point Graham made is right on target. You know, actually, we were already on the LMS prior to the pandemic, and probably the most frequent positive feedback that I got from our faculty when we first went to the LMS was, wow, once I got used to it, it saved me so much time because it relieved me from burdens like the grade sheets all automatic now, and you know, and the weighted grading, and there's so many various administrative overhead things that these platforms take care of for you. So I think it comes back also just to make sure that everyone is properly trained on how to do these things. You know, so that is definitely the tech side. But then also, I think, you know, on the human side, one of the things that we did to relieve stress is that we actually took an entire week in the middle of the term, and we suspended regular class, but we still did live sessions, but we did fun events, you know, for both the students and the faculty, and just kind of lightened the mood a bit. And you know, so I think that you just have to think about just creative ways, you know, to deal with the stress. This is definitely, you know, one of the challenges we all have around the world.
And actually, I do have something I'd like to add to that. When building out my courses, I started to use a Pomodoro technique. I would teach for 25 minutes and I would build in a 5-minute break.
Mm.
I needed that 5-minute break. My students needed to know that there was a 5-minute break coming on. So in many cases, I will overlay an online timer that shows how, I'm just asking them to focus for 25 minutes. And building in breaks for your students and for yourself can help reduce some of that stress. It allows you to regroup, to find that toggle, to find that, it just allows a little bit of downtime built into the class session for everyone.
My next question I'm going to put to you, Graham, if I can. It's from a Cislo, who is a faculty researcher at the University of Agustin, which is in the Philippines. And their question is, and you did sort of touch on it before, but could you expand a bit more on the ethical considerations that should go into the development of EdTech, and how we can ensure that learners' data remains private? Do you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of laws around the world, such as GDPR, which are very stringent. And you know, you can't share the data with anybody else without letting them know. If there's any kind of security breach, we have to announce it within X number of days. If somebody wants to export their personal data and then request you to delete it, we provide that. So we're compliant with all of those things. And one of the things about our company is that we make money by people using our system. We don't make money by selling marketing data or spamming people or trying to sell add-on products. So our business model is very, very simple. But yeah, so we adhere to all those quite stringent standards around the world. And if there are additional standards that come out, we'll adhere to them as well. So I think people are pretty safe in our hands.
I have an interesting question here. The person doesn't leave their name, but they do mention that they're based in a university in Peru, and they ask, what is your view on the number of synchronous teaching hours? They say that their college has decided to keep the same number of hours that they had on campus, which to them seems impossible in the long term. Does anyone have any perspective on whether or not we should be rethinking the timetable and the amount of hours that people should be studying if they're studying online as well as on campus?
So I can respond, and I won't claim that we have the magic answer, but back to my point earlier about experimentation and trying things, we definitely felt like keeping that number of, you know, live synchronous hours would be too much. So we actually first experimented with sort of a 1/3, 2/3 formula, where it was 1/3 synchronous, 2/3 asynchronous. We then reviewed with both our faculty and students at the end of last term. We decided that maybe actually we needed to move the synchronous level up a bit. So we sort of flipped it this term with the other way around, 2/3 synchronous, a third asynchronous, and then and then surveying both faculty and the students and monitoring experience. So I think again, it's going to be probably situational dependent, the type of school, the type of courses and things like that. But I would just encourage people to, be willing to experiment and find out what works for your institution.
One final question that I'm going to ask, and the question is about essentially how universities and colleges can help students catch up if they feel they have fallen behind in this last year. EdTech might be part of the solution, there might be other solutions, but it's perhaps an important thing for teachers and educators to be thinking about. Does anybody have any perspective on that?
Yeah, I certainly do. One of the things that we've done quite a lot of work on are various webinars related to how to create really engaging asynchronous courses. And one of the really nice things is that once you learn how to create these nice asynchronous courses, they can be literally taken by anyone, anytime, any place. And so, whether they're very sophisticated or just medium or even a little bit, the nice thing is you can make all of those materials available to people who feel like they've been falling behind. And that's one of the great strengths of asynchronous learning, is that it's easy to, in quote, catch up. Take a look at Masterclass, which is a very popular online learning platform, which is used by celebrities to teach various things. I can sign up for Masterclass and learn anything I want from, Venus Williams or someone like that. It's quite incredible. So I would just say getting good and learning how to build asynchronous courses can definitely be part of the EdTech solution to that problem.
Does anyone have anything they'd like to add to that?
I would just add that the other thing that you can do, which the tech really helps a lot with, is the earlier you can intervene, the better, right? So rather than waiting and finding out someone, by the time you get around to final exam, was way behind, which oftentimes has been the case in the past, the platforms, if used correctly, allow you to pick up on that much sooner. And so then you can intervene, and indeed we do. We actually have a weekly process where we have faculty submit reports, even for the asynchronous learning. They monitor and they see what's going on, and then we actually have a team that intervenes for students that we detect are having difficulty, right? So I think that's also very important and enabled by the technology.
Great. Well, with that, our hour is complete. Thank you so much to Graham, to Colin, and to Kathy for joining me. There's so much more that we could talk about, and there are so many more questions from our audience that we could take, but hopefully these are all things that we could pick up again in the future. Thanks again for watching. If you have any more questions, do send them through to us, because we can contact the panelists on your behalf, and they can, I'm sure, get back to you in some time. Thanks again, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you. Stay well, everyone.
You too.